On screen, he was a cheerful father, but the truth is, Max Wright hated ALF so much, he walked off without saying goodbye. The world knew him as Max Wright, ALF, yet he was actually a serious stage actor suffering a severe identity crisis. He traded his theater career for a network paycheck, only to face the daily humiliation of acting as a human prop in a ridiculous sitcom. Behind the fake smile, he was a real artist forced to serve a foam puppet. Why did a respected actor silently abandon the exact role that made him globally famous? For 4 years, he portrayed Willie Tanner, the exasperated father and straight man, to a wisecracking alien puppet named ALF. It was a program that brought him immense financial security and permanent pop culture fame. But on a spring day in 1990, when the director finally called cut on the very last scene of the series, there was no celebration. According to crew members and co-stars present on the soundstage, the atmosphere was thick and utterly joyless. Max Wright did not cheer. He did not embrace the colleagues he had worked alongside for nearly half a decade. He offered no words of gratitude. Instead, he stood up, walked directly to his dressing room, packed his belongings, and went out to his car. He drove off the studio lot and vanished into the Los Angeles traffic without saying a single word of goodbye to anyone. It was an act of cold, silent rebellion, the desperate escape of a man who believed his artistic soul had been hollowed out by a foam prop. Behind the canned laughter lay a deeply respected artist who came to utterly despise the very role that made him a household name, choosing to walk away from his global triumph with profound unspoken disgust. George Edward Maxwell Wright was not a product of the Hollywood machine. He was forged in the demanding, unglamorous world of regional theater. Born in Detroit in 1943, he never chased the superficial spotlight of television fame. Instead, he dedicated his early life to the grueling intellectual rigor of the stage. By the late 1960s, his intense commitment had carried him to Broadway, where he appeared in the monumental original production of The Great White Hope. He immersed himself in the heavy, complex texts of Shakespeare and Chekhov, building a formidable reputation across North American theaters. To his peers and the critics who watched him, Wright was a serious heavyweight character actor. His performances were defined by a kinetic, nervous energy and a relentless drive for psychological realism. He approached his craft with strict reverence, demanding absolute authenticity from himself and those who shared the stage with him. The broad, predictable, and often ridiculous mechanics of commercial television comedy were completely opposed to his artistic philosophy. He viewed acting not as a means to entertain the masses with cheap laughs, but as a profound exploration of the human condition. However, the prestige of the theater is notoriously unforgiving when it comes to making a living. As Wright entered his 40s, the harsh practical realities of providing for his family began to clash with the romantic ideals of a working stage actor. The critical acclaim of a Broadway run does not guarantee a steady paycheck. He found himself facing a classic artist's dilemma, the desperate need for financial stability against the purity of his craft. He needed a reliable income, something the unpredictable stage simply could not promise. And then in 1986, a television network presented an offer for a new sitcom, a role that promised to permanently solve his financial struggles, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The year 1986 represented a specific golden era for the American television network. The situation comedy was the dominant cultural force, a money-making machine that pumped millions of dollars into the studios and turned jobbing actors into global icons overnight. For a working professional in the unmeant industry, landing a leading role on an NBC sitcom was the equivalent of winning a financial lottery. It meant an end to the brutal uncertainty of auditioning. It meant guaranteed syndication royalties. It meant generational wealth. For Max Wright, entering his mid-40s and weary from the relentless, unstable grind of the theater circuit, the offer was impossible to refuse. He had spent decades earning the respect of theater critics, but respect does not pay mortgages. The decision to step away from the footlights of the stage and under the fluorescent grids of a television studio was not made out of a sudden passion for lowbrow comedy. It was a calculated, necessary surrender to the practical realities of adult life. He signed the contract. He traded the artistic purity of the stage for the absolute financial security of network television. He believed he was making a smart, pragmatic compromise. He did not yet know he was signing away his identity. When the initial script for the pilot episode arrived, the premise was undeniably absurd. An alien from the planet Melmac crashes his spaceship into the garage of a typical suburban family in the San Fernando Valley. However, beneath the ridiculous science fiction setup, Wright saw a role he believed he could anchor. The character of Willie Tanner was written as a social worker, an amateur radio enthusiast, and a dedicated family man. Wright approached this material with the exact same intellectual rigor he would apply to a classical stage play. He did not intend to play Willie Tanner as a cartoon character. He intended to play him as a genuine, grounded human being dealing with an extraordinary circumstance. He reasoned that the comedy would only work if the family felt entirely real. His job, as he saw it, was to provide the dramatic ballast to the show. He would be the anchor of a normality, reacting with genuine frustration and panic to the chaos caused by the alien. He envisioned himself executing the classic role of the comedic straight man, a proud theatrical tradition demanding impeccable timing, subtle physical reactions, and quiet authority. He expected to elevate the material through his sheer competence. In those early days, the illusion of a standard collaborative production remained intact. Wright arrived on the studio lot expecting the typical dynamic of a television ensemble. He looked forward to building a rapport with his on-screen wife, Anne Shadeen, and establishing a believable family dynamic with the younger actors. He anticipated the standard rehearsal process where actors block out their movements, test different line deliveries, and find the natural rhythm of a scene together. In a normal television environment, the cast forms a cohesive unit, feeding off each other's energy to build the narrative. Wright assumed he was stepping into a position of leadership on the set. As the most experienced, classically trained actor in the adult cast, he naturally expected to be the anchor around which the human element of the show revolved. He believed his artistic voice would be respected. He believed he was hired to act. This illusion shattered almost immediately upon his first interaction with the reality of the production. The disruption did not come from the network executives or a demanding director. It came from the creator of the show, Paul Fusco, and the physical object he carried. Fusco was not just the showrunner and the head writer. He was the puppeteer and the voice of the alien. When the puppet was finally brought onto the stage, the true hierarchy of the production was instantly revealed. The alien was not a prop. It was not a special effect added in post-production. The puppet was treated with the reverence of a lead actor, and Fusco was the undisputed dictator of its movements and its dialogue. The first table read was a sobering experience. As the cast sat in a circle reading through the script, the power dynamic became brutally clear. The executives in the room did not laugh at Wright's carefully crafted, subtle deliveries. They laughed exclusively at the loud, abrasive punchlines delivered by Fusco through the character of ALF. Wright realized very quickly that the script was not balanced. The narrative structure was entirely designed to set up the puppet. Willie Tanner was not a complex patriarch dealing with an alien invasion. He was merely a human stepping stone, a mechanism to deliver the setup line so the puppet could spike the joke. Wright's extensive theatrical training, his ability to convey deep emotion, his mastery of pacing, none of it mattered. He was there to serve the foam. The fundamental conflict struck at the very core of his professional training. The entire foundation of stage acting rests on the principle of connection. Actors are trained to observe their scene partners, to look deeply into their eyes, to listen to the subtle shifts in their breathing, and to react authentically to microscopic changes in human expression. Acting is, at its essence, reacting to another living soul. When the cameras began to roll on the set of ALF, Wright found himself staring into a void. He was forced to perform complex emotional beats while looking at a lifeless piece of synthetic fur and plastic eyes that could not convey a single human emotion. There was nothing to read. There was no energy to feed off. It was a completely sterile, dead interaction. To compound this artistic nightmare, the voice of his scene partner was disconnected from the physical object. Because Paul Fusco was operating the puppet from hidden trenches, cut into the floor of the set, his voice emanated from below Wright's feet, not from the mouth of the alien. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. Wright had to look at a motionless puppet, pretend it was speaking, and ignore the actual human voice shouting dialogue from a hole in the ground. It required a complete dismantling of his instincts. He could not rely on the natura, all rhythm of human conversation. He had to artificially manufacture his reactions, forcing out expressions of shock, anger, or amusement into an empty space. For an actor who prided himself on absolute psychological realism, this process felt entirely fraudulent. It was the antithesis of everything he had learned in the theater. It felt like a betrayal of his craft. As the first weeks of filming dragged on, the initial promises of easy television money began to sour. The physical environment of the set proved to be entirely hostile to the human performers. The stage was not built for actors. It was an elaborate, hazardous mechanism built exclusively to hide puppeteers. Wright found himself constantly restricted, unable to move naturally or use his physical space to enhance his performance. He was confined to specific marks on the floor, forced to stand rigidly, while technicians spent agonizing minutes adjusting the puppet's fur, fixing its mechanics, or changing its posture. The humans were left waiting. Wright would stand under the hot studio lights, silently watching a crew of grown men fuss over a doll, while his own preparation and focus drained away. He quickly recognized the trap he had stepped into. He had been hired to be the straight man, but he was denied the dignity that usually accompanies the role. A great straight man controls the tempo of the comedy. He holds the power in the scene, anchoring the absurdity of his comic partner. But Wright had no control. The tempo was entirely dictated by the mechanical limitations of the puppet and the whims of its creator. Wright's lines were repeatedly rewritten or cut down to make more room for the alien's wisecracks. He was stripped of his agency. He was no longer a collaborating artist. He was a human prop, hired to make the real prop look good. The financial rewards were exactly as promised. The checks cleared, the show became an immediate massive rating success, and his family's future was secured. But the O&I. Earnal cost was immediate and devastating. He would drive home from the studio lot in the dead of night, the canned laughter of the studio audience still ringing in his ears, knowing that he had spent 14 hours talking to a piece of foam. He realized that millions of people were watching him, but no one was actually seeing him act. They were seeing a man execute a mechanical function. The stage actor who had tackled Shakespeare was now globally famous for arguing with a puppet about eating the family cat. The illusion of the easy television job had completely evaporated. The money could not insulate him from the profound sense of professional degradation. He was trapped in a highly lucrative, highly visible prison of his own making. He could not break his contract, and he could not change the nature of the show. He had secured his livelihood, but he felt he had sold his artistic soul to do it. But the joy was short-lived, as he had to face daily humiliation. The specific agony Max Wright endured was built directly into the physical architecture of his daily prison. Stage 3 at the Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank was not a traditional television set. It was a booby-trapped battleground, constructed entirely to serve a foam master. The Tanner family living room, which appeared so warm and inviting on television screens across the globe, was in reality an elevated platform built 4 feet off the studio floor. This elevation was not an artistic choice. It was a mechanical necessity. The entire floor of the set was a honeycomb of trap doors, trenches, and open pits. These hidden chasms allowed Paul Fusco and his team of 3 assistant puppeteers to navigate beneath the actors, manipulating the alien from below. For the human cast, simply walking across their own fictional living room was a dangerous, hyper-calculated exercise. Wright could not stride confidently into a scene. He could not rely on the spontaneous physical instincts that had defined his stage career, ever. A step had to be mathematically mapped out to avoid plummeting into a trench and crushing a puppeteer. The physical freedom of the actor was entirely stripped away. He was forced to stand rigidly on predetermined marks, balancing on narrow strips of solid wood, paralyzed by the logistical hazards of his own set. This physical restriction was the first daily humiliation. An actor uses his entire body as an instrument of expression. Wright was denied this fundamental tool. He was bolted to the floor, forced to deliver his lines with the stiffness of a hostage, physically locked in place so the puppet could move freely. The nightmare of the physical space was immediately compounded by the agonizing manipulation of time. A standard multi-camera sitcom of the 1980s operated on a highly efficient schedule. A typical 22-minute episode could usually be filmed in a single evening, often in under 5 hours, riding the adrenaline of a live studio audience. The set of this production operated under a radically different, punishing timeline. Because the puppet required a minimum of 4 grown men to operate its mouth, eyes, ears, and arms simultaneously, the technical coordination was staggeringly complex. A single simple action, the alien reaching for a sandwich or turning its head to deliver a line, could take dozens of takes to coordinate. As a result, a single 30-minute episode routinely took 20 to 25 grueling hours to shoot. The human actors were dragged into a marathon of waiting. Wright, a classically trained professional, accustomed to the fast, fluid momentum of a live theater performance, found his momentum constantly shattered. He would be called to the set, fully in character, only to stand in silence under the blistering heat of the studio lights, while technicians spent 45 minutes brushing the puppet's fur. He would wait while mechanics fixed a jammed cable in the alien's eyebrow. He would wait while the puppeteers reset their positions, NS in the trenches below. Hours would bleed into days. The sheer exhaustion was weaponized against his craft. By the time the camera actually rolled, the organic energy of the scene was utterly dead. Wright was not acting. He was merely surviving the clock. The artistic process was replaced by industrial endurance. This extreme technical delay forced Wright into a state of permanent, simmering frustration. The psychological toll of standing in a fake kitchen at 3 a.m, reciting lines to an empty chair while men in the floorboards argued over a mechanical hand, was devastating. It was a daily visceral reminder that his time, his energy, and his talent were considered entirely secondary to the maintenance of a prop. He was a highly paid spectator to his own television show. The deepest humiliation, however, was written directly into the scripts. Comedy is a precise mathematical equation. It relies on a delicate balance of tension and release. In a traditional comedic partnership, the straight man is the architect of the joke. He builds the tension, establishes the reality of the situation, and serves the setup on a silver platter so his partner can deliver the punchline and release the tension. It is a symbiotic relationship requiring mutual respect and perfect timing. Wright was hired to be the straight man, but he was systematically robbed of the payoff. The scripts were heavily skewed, designed to funnel every ounce of comedic glory directly to the puppet. Willie Tanner was not allowed to be funny. He was not allowed to be clever. He was required to be a perpetual victim of the alien's chaotic behavior. Wright would expend massive amounts of intellectual energy crafting a believable reaction of horror or exasperation, building the scene with intense dramatic focus. But the climax of the scene was never his. The punchline, the moment that triggers the laugh and secures the audience's affection, was always handed to the inanimate object. Wright found himself in the degrading position of serving as a human laugh track generator for a piece of foam. He would set the trap and the puppet would take the cheese. The indignity of this dynamic cannot be overstated for an actor of Wright's caliber. He was a man who understood the intricate mechanics of a Chekhovian monologue, now forced to play the fool to a burping alien. He was acting his heart out, providing a masterclass in grounded, realistic frustration, only to have the scene stolen by a mechanical ear wiggle. The showrunner, operating the puppet from the trenches, was essentially stealing Wright's comedic timing and claiming the laughs for himself. Wright was doing all the heavy lifting, establishing the stakes and the reality, but the puppet reaped all the rewards. This dynamic required a horrific form of psychological dissociation. To survive the workday, Wright had to actively suppress his own instincts. The fundamental rule of acting is that acting is reacting. An actor looks into the eyes of their scene partner, reads their micro-expressions, and responds truthfully in the moment. On this set, there were no eyes to read. There was only dead plastic. When Wright delivered a deeply emotional or frustrated monologue to the alien, he was met with a blank, unblinking stare. There was no reciprocity. It was an artistic vacuum. Furthermore, the voice of his antagonist did not even come from the creature itself. The dialogue was shouted from the trapdoors beneath his feet. Wright had to physically detach his sight from his hearing. He had to look at the puppet's face, pretend the voice was coming from its mouth, and ignore the very real, very human voice echoing from the floorboards. It was an exhausting, deeply unnatural exercise in manufactured reality. He was forced to build on-screen chemistry with an inanimate object. Every reaction shot of Willie Tanner looking shocked, angry, or amused was completely fabricated in isolation. It was an illusion sustained entirely by Wright's sheer, desperate willpower and his formidable technical skill. But utilizing Juilliard-level technique to argue with a doll is a soul-crushing endeavor. The public perception of his work began to warp his own sense of self. The studio audiences that were brought in to record the laugh tracks made the hierarchy brutally clear. They did not cheer for the nuanced, difficult work Wright was doing to hold the chaotic narrative together. They roared with laughter the moment the puppet appeared. The fan mail pouring into the studio was not addressed to the classically trained stage actor. It was addressed to the furry alien. The merchandise, the lunch boxes, the posters, none of it featured the human cast. Wright was becoming invisible within his own success. The more famous the show became, the more his identity as a serious artist was erased. He was no longer George Edward Maxwell Wright, the formidable stage presence. He was simply the dad from that alien show. The daily grind of the production reinforced this erasure every single hour. He was marginalized on the call sheet, marginalized on the set, and marginalized in the scripts. The steady, massive paychecks he received were no longer viewed as compensation. They felt like hush money. He was being paid handsomely to stand still, shut up, and let the puppet shine. The humiliation was absolute, and as the years dragged on, the quiet, obedient, straight man began to curdle into something far more dangerous. The silent suffering was reaching its critical mass. The human nervous system is not equipped to sustain a prolonged state of suppressed humiliation. For Max Wright, the effort required to mask his professional degradation eventually exhausted every ounce of his physical and mental reserves. As the production dragged into its later seasons, the soundstage of Stage 3 was no longer merely a difficult workplace. It had transformed into a psychological containment zone. The polite, disciplined facade that T had utilized to survive the early years completely disintegrated. The dedicated professional vanished, replaced by a highly volatile, deeply embittered man who could no longer hide his absolute contempt for the production, the crew, and the synthetic creature that dictated every waking hour of his life. Wright's unraveling was rooted in the microscopic details of his daily routine. His existence on set became an exercise in sensory deprivation and emotional starvation. A classically trained actor thrives on momentum, on the rhythmic exchange of energy with a scene partner. But on this set, momentum was impossible. Because of the staggering technical requirements of the puppet, a single rudimentary scene, something as mundane as Willie Tanner walking into the kitchen and expressing surprise, could take hours to set up. Wright would be called from his dressing room, fully in character, only to stand on a precarious platform over open trenches, waiting. He would stand under the blistering heat of the studio lights, sweat pooling under the heavy, colorful sweaters of his character, while 3 grown men in the floorboards argued over a jammed servo motor in the alien's eyebrow. During these agonizing delays, Wright was completely isolated. He could not pace the set to maintain his energy because the floor was a minefield of trapdoors. He could not engage in the usual light-hearted banter with the camera crew because his frustration had built a visible wall around him. He simply stood rigid, staring at the lifeless prop, feeling his formidable talent atrophy. The silence between takes was deafening. He was a formidable theatrical talent, a man capable of delivering Shakespearean soliloquies, reduced to a highly paid mannequin. This environment systematically dismantled his coping mechanisms. The dressing room, traditionally a sanctuary where an actor prepares and centers themselves, became a bunker of despair. It was within these four walls that industry insiders and CCAS room members noted a dark, devastating shift in his behavior. Wright began to seek out chemical anesthetics. He turned to heavy drinking during production hours. This was not the celebratory drinking of a Hollywood star basking in the glow of a hit television program. It was the grim, utilitarian drinking of a man trying to numb a visceral pain. He required a barrier between his intellect and the sheer, crushing absurdity of his reality. The alcohol served as a tactical shield. It took the sharpest edges off the indignity of his daily tasks. It allowed him to temporarily detach his mind from the fact that his lines were continually being cut to make room for the puppet's punchlines. But the physical toll of this internal warfare became impossible to conceal. Crew members began to notice the subtle tragic changes. His eyes, once sharp and intensely expressive on the theatrical stage, frequently carried a heavy, deadened glaze. His posture, usually commanding, grew stiff and defensive. He was performing a secondary, far more difficult role off camera. He was acting sober, desperately trying to hold his fractured psyche together, while the studio audience roared with laughter at a foam doll. This immense gravity of his resentment inevitably poisoned the dynamic of the entire human cast. A successful sitcom relies heavily on the off-camera chemistry of its ensemble, a shared camaraderie that translates into on-screen warmth. On stage 3, that chemistry was a total, absolute fabrication. Wright's anger was too massive, a black hole that consumed whatever oxygen was left in the room. He alienated himself from his co-stars. He could not bring himself to play the warm, comforting father figure once the director yelled, "Cut." Anne Shadeen, the actress tasked with playing his wife, later described the environment in blunt, unromantic terms. She labeled the cast a highly dysfunctional family. The human actors were completely isolated from one another, united only by their char, alienation from the puppet's creator, Paul Fusco, who remained permanently entrenched in the trenches below. There was no joy, no creative collaboration. The actors did not look at each other between setups. They stared at the floor, exhausted and defeated. Wright became a ghost on his own set. He was a man doing hard time, marking off the days on his calendar with the grim determination of a prisoner. This escalating psychological pressure, the claustrophobia, the drinking, the artistic starvation, and the relentless dominance of the puppet, eventually ruptured in an incident that cemented the set's dark, hidden legacy. It was the precise moment the invisible barrier between the actor's internal torment and the physical reality of the production shattered. During the filming of a particularly grueling scene, after hours of agonizing technical delays, botched takes, and the mechanical limitations of the alien, Wright simply snapped. He bypassed the creator in the floorboards. He bypassed the director behind the monitors. He aimed his fury directly at the physical manifestation of his ruined career. According to multiple widely circulated accounts from those present on the soundstage, Wright physically attacked the ALF puppet. It was an explosion of pure, unfiltered desperation. He lunged across the set, grabbed the foam and synthetic fur, and violently assaulted the prop. He screamed at it. He directed years of suppressed humiliation, intellectual starvation, and raw, visceral hatred into a lifeless object. To an outside observer unaware of the context, the sight of a grown man, a respected theatrical veteran, violently wrestling a television doll is deeply absurd. But on that soundstage, there was absolutely no laughter. It was a terrifying display of a complete psychological breakdown. The crew froze in stunned silence. He was not attacking a piece of foam. He was attempting to physically destroy the entity that had stolen his dignity, erased his identity, and hijacked his professional life. The physical altercation was quickly subdued. The puppet was repaired. But the psychological damage to the production was irreversible. The incident stripped away the final thin layer of professional pretense. After that day, nobody pretended they were making art. Nobody pretended they were a family. The crew walked on eggshells, actively avoiding eye contact with the leading man. The atmosphere devolved into a grim, silent death march. Wright had laid his absolute hatred bare for the entire studio to see, and now the only objective left for everyone involved was to simply survive until the expiration of the network contracts. That expiration date finally arrived in the spring of 1990. The network, noting declining ratings and the staggering financial costs of the grueling production schedule, decided to cancel the series. The script for the 75th episode was distributed. Ironically, it was titled Consider Me Gone. For the fans of the program, it was the heartbreaking end of a beloved cultural phenomenon. For Max Wright, it was a pardon from the governor. There was no sentimentality during that final week of production. There were no nostalgic speeches, no tearful reflections on the legacy they had built, and no lingering looks at the set. Wright treated the final script with the cold mechanical efficiency of an executioner. He memorized his lines, he hit his marks, and he waited for the clock to run out. The exhaustion on his face during those final scenes was not acting. It was the absolute depletion of his life force. The final day of shooting culminated in a single defining moment. The cameras were set for the very last shot of the series. Wright stepped onto the elevated platform, navigating the treacherous floorboards for the final time. He stood under the blistering studio lights. The clapperboard snapped. The director called action. Wright delivered his final piece of dialogue, executing the required reaction shot with. It's the deadened precision of a man who had entirely checked out of his own body. He held his mark. He stared at the puppet. He waited. "Cut," the director called out. "That's a series wrap." In the television industry, those words are the trigger for immense emotional release. They are universally followed by thunderous applause, champagne, tears, and profound embraces among colleagues who have shared the trenches for years. It is a moment of collective catharsis. But Max Wright did not wait for the applause. He did not turn to shake the hand of the director. He did not look down into the trenches to acknowledge Paul Fusco. He completely ignored the actors who had played his television family. The exact second the word "cut" echoed across the quiet soundstage, Wright's contractual obligations evaporated. He acted with immediate, brutal decisiveness. He turned his back on the camera. His face, frozen in a mask of grim determination, did not betray a single emotion. He walked off the set and headed in a straight line directly to his dressing room. That final cut wasn't just a wrap, it was a desperate severance. The costume came off, the dressing room was cleared in minutes, and Wright vanished into the Burbank sun. He left Willie Tanner entirely on the soundstage, convinced that by physically abandoning the set and returning to his theatrical roots, he would be completely free of the puppet's shadow. He believed the nightmare was over, unaware that the ghost of the sitcom dad was already preparing to follow him for the rest of his life. The illusion of a clean escape is a luxury rarely afforded to television actors. When Max Wright drove his car out of the California studio lot for the final time, he was operating under the assumption that his geographical distance from the soundstage equated to an artistic liberation. He believed that by physically removing himself from the environment, by leaving behind the elevated platforms, the hidden trenches, and the synthetic fur, he had successfully severed the cord. He packed up his life in Los Angeles, turning his back on the epicenter of commercial television, and fled back to the East Coast. He returned to the strict, unforgiving, and deeply respectful world of the theater. This was not merely a change of address, it was a desperate pilgrimage. He needed a profound artistic cleansing. He needed to wash off the cheap manufactured residue of the sitcom and rebuild the muscles of a serious, classically trained artist. What Wright fundamentally underestimated, however, was the ruthless, immortal machinery of global television syndication. A stage performance is a fleeting, ephemeral event. It exists only in the room, dying the moment the curtain falls, living on purely in the memory of the audience. A successful 1980s network sitcom, conversely, is permanent. The instant production ceased, the 75 episodes he had agonized over were packaged, sold, and broadcast across the globe in dozens of languages. They played in continuous, inescapable loops on afternoon television. While Wright was in New York, actively trying to bury the character of Willie Tanner, millions of people were just discovering him. He had fled the physical set, but his image was completely trapped within the broadcast signal. The ghost of the genial, exasperated father figure had already detached itself from the studio and was now living independently in living rooms from Middle America to Western Europe. Ignorant of this encroaching shadow, Wright threw himself into the theatrical trenches with the intensity of a starving man. He sought out the heaviest, most intellectually demanding texts available. He did not want light comedy. He did not want family-friendly narratives. He actively pursued complex human darkness. He immersed himself in the works of Anton Chekhov, a playwright whose material demands a microscopic understanding of human misery, existential dread, and the quiet, crushing tragedies of ordinary life. On a physical stage, breathing the same air as his scene partners, Wright felt his agency return. He was no longer reacting to a lifeless prop or a voice shouting from beneath the floorboards. He was looking directly into the eyes of other highly trained professionals, engaging in the profound reciprocal exchange of emotional truth that forms the bedrock of dramatic art. Throughout the 1990s, he meticulously reconstructed his reputation within the theatrical community. His performances were not merely competent, they were formidable. This relentless drive for artistic reclamation reached its absolute zenith in the late 1990s, culminating in his casting as Pavel Lebedev in a major Lincoln Center revival of Chekhov's Ivanov. This was not a role for a lightweight entertainer. It required a profound grasp of melancholy, a deep excavation of a man watching his life and ideals slowly disintegrate. Wright tackled the role with a devastating surgical precision. He channeled every ounce of his formidable technique and perhaps subconsciously the lingering trauma of his own professional compromises into the performance. The result was a masterpiece of stagecraft. The critical establishment, notorious for its strict standards, bowed to his talent. In 1998, Max Wright received a nomination for the Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Play. Within the rigid, hierarchical ecosystem of the acting profession, there is no higher mark of intellectual and artistic validation. A Tony nomination for a Chekhovian role is the ultimate proof of a stage actor's pedigree. For a brief, euphoric moment, Wright had achieved the impossible. He had descended into the absolute commercial depths of Hollywood, endured the humiliation of serving as a punchline mechanism for a puppet, and successfully climbed his way back to the summit of theatrical high art. He was seen by his peers as George Edward Maxwell Wright, the theatrical powerhouse. But this victory was entirely localized. It existed on its own, within the walls of the theater. The moment Wright pushed open the stage doors and stepped out onto the pavements of Manhattan, the illusion of his reclaimed identity violently shattered. The collision between his theatrical reality and his television legacy was brutal. The mathematical cruelty of mass media dictated his existence. A critically acclaimed run on Broadway might be witnessed by 50,000 people over the course of several months. A single syndicated rerun of his sitcom was consumed by tens of millions of people in a single afternoon. The sheer volume of his commercial success completely drowned out the quiet prestige of his theatrical triumphs. To the general public walking the streets of New York, he was not the brilliant, nuanced interpreter of Russian literature. He was and would always be the dad with the glasses. He was the man who yelled at the alien. Strangers would spot him on the sidewalk. They did not approach him to discuss the subtle complexities of his performance in Ivanov. They approached him to bark sitcom catchphrases in his face. They walked up to him with warm, familiar smiles, fully expecting to interact with the harmless, bumbling Willie Tanner. They felt they owned a piece of him because he had been a fixture in their homes every week. Every single one of these interactions, no matter how well intentioned by the fan, was a microscopic psychological assault. It was a constant, daily, inescapable reminder that his greatest artistic achievements were completely invisible to the vast majority of the human race. He was globally famous for the exact work he most deeply despised. This crisis of identity extended far beyond irritating street-level encounters. It fundamentally poisoned his ability to work in front of a camera. As he attempted to parlay his theatrical resurgence into serious, dramatic film and television roles, he hit an impenetrable wall. The casting directors of Hollywood, operating in an industry notoriously averse to risk, simply could not look past the colorful sweaters of the 1980s. Wright was cursed with the ultimate industry stigma. He was heavily typecast as a sitcom dad. He possessed a face that instantly triggered a laugh track in the collective subconscious of the audience. It did not matter if his audition for a dramatic thriller or a heavy procedural was flawless. His mere presence in a frame broke the reality of the scene. Producers feared that the moment Max Wright appeared on screen, the audience would stop focusing on the dramatic stakes and subconsciously wait for a puppet to burst through the door. His commercial success had built a steel cage around his on-screen career that his actual talent could not break. He was deemed too recognizable, too inherently tied to a specific brand of lowbrow, absurd comedy, to ever be trusted with heavyweight material on film. The industry had permanently boxed him in. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. Wright found himself trapped in a profound, unresolvable paradox. He had spent his entire adult life building a formidable set of tools to explore the depths of the human condition, only to realize the world only wanted him to perform a single, humiliating trick. He was a man split violently down the middle, living a deeply fractured existence. He was revered by a small, elite circle of theatrical purists, yet reduced to a global punchline by the masses. To cope with this permanent erasure of his true self, Wright built a fortress of absolute silence. He weaponized his refusal to speak. For years, he categorically refused to discuss the sitcom in any capacity. If a journalist during a press junket for a play dared to bring up the alien, Wright's demeanor would instantly turn to ice. His face would harden into a mask of cold contempt, and he would shut the interview down. He barred the topic entirely. He tried to starve the ghost by simply refusing to acknowledge its existence. He believed that if he never spoke the name of the show, it would eventually lose its power over him. But the silence offered no protection. It only internalized the bitterness, allowing it to calcify into a hard, dense resentment. He realized, with a quiet, devastating certainty, that his legacy was no longer in his own hands. He could spend the rest of his life delivering award-winning performances on the stage, but the first line of his obituary was already written in stone by a network television executive in 1986. The inescapable shadow of his own commercial triumph was suffocating him. He had fought a desperate battle to reclaim his name, but the ghost of Willie Tanner had won. The profound exhaustion of this unwinnable war was slowly breaking him down, setting the stage for a tragic collapse that would soon shatter his life entirely. A fortress built entirely on silence and suppressed rage will inevitably crumble from within. For Max Wright, the rigid walls he had constructed to separate his dignified theatrical reality from the humiliating legacy of his television career could not hold forever. The human mind can only compartmentalize a profound crisis of identity for a finite period before the internal pressure seeks an external release. As the 1990s bled into the new millennium, the quiet, simmering bitterness that Wright had harbored for a decade mutated into a highly visible, deeply destructive downward spiral. The man who had spent 4 years playing the quintessential, reliable American patriarch was about to become the tragic centerpiece of a brutal public spectacle. The collapse did not happen overnight. It was the slow, agonizing deterioration of a man who realized he had definitively lost control over his own narrative. Stripped of his ability to define himself as a serious artist in the eyes of the global public, Wright sought refuge in the only mechanism that offered immediate, albeit temporary, oblivion. The reliance on alcohol, which had begun as a tactical anesthetic in his dressing room on the studio lot, now metastasized into a full-blown addiction. But this was not the glamorous, high-profile substance abuse often associated with Hollywood excess. This was a dark, solitary, and grim descent. It was the desperate coping strategy of an aging, exhausted actor trying to numb the relentless, echoing cognitive dissonance of his life. He was a premium stage talent drowning in a sea of sitcom syndication, using liquor to simply turn the volume down. This private agony violently breached the public surface in January 2000. Wright was pulled over by the police in Los Angeles and arrested for driving under the influence. For an ordinary citizen, a DUI is a serious legal infraction and a personal failure. But for a man whose face was globally synonymous with wholesome suburban fatherhood, it was a media event. The arrest shattered the carefully maintained illusion of his public persona. The police booking photograph, the mugshot, was immediately circulated by the press. It presented a shocking, visceral contrast to the image audiences held in their minds. The public did not see Max Wright, the struggling man. They saw Willie Tanner, the responsible dad in the colorful sweater, looking disheveled, intoxicated, and defeated under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a police precinct. The media reaction was swift and devoid of empathy. The tabloid press, which thrives on the destruction of wholesome archetypes, seized upon the arrest with gleeful cruelty. They weaponized his television legacy against him. The headlines did not read veteran stage actor arrested. They screamed ALF dad busted. His decades of rigorous theatrical training and his Tony nomination were entirely irrelevant to the news cycle. He was reduced to a punchline all over again, but this time the comedy was replaced by public humiliation. The arrest was a brutal confirmation that his identity was inextricably chained to the puppet. Even in his darkest personal moments, the press forced him to share the headline with a foam alien. The 2000 arrest was a severe blow, but it was merely a tremor compared to the catastrophic earthquake that struck his life a year later. In 2001, a notorious American tabloid published a sprawling, explosive exposé detailing devastating allegations regarding Wright's highly private life. The article claimed to possess video evidence of Wright engaging in illicit drug use and participating in underground, highly stigmatized activities. The absolute factual accuracy, the context, and the ethics of how the tabloid obtained this alleged material remain fiercely debated, but in the court of public opinion, the truth was irrelevant. The damage was instantaneous and absolute. This scandal was not just an invasion of privacy. It was a total demolition of his character. The early 2000s tabloid culture operated without a shred of human decency, and Wright was the perfect target. The publication intentionally framed the exposé to maximize the shock value, juxtaposing the sordid details of his alleged private life directly against photographs of him smiling with his television family. They expertly engineered a narrative of supreme hypocrisy. The public, feeling a bizarre sense of ownership over his sitcom persona, reacted with a mixture of shock, moral outrage, and vicious mockery. People complained that their childhoods were ruined, completely failing to recognize the very real, very human tragedy of a man whose life was disintegrating in real time. The fallout from the scandal was catastrophic across every metric of his existence. The industry, already hesitant to cast him due to his sitcom stigma, now blacklisted him entirely. He became radioactive. No studio or network would touch an actor embroiled in such a sordid, highly publicized controversy. His primary source of income evaporated. The financial stability he had sacrificed his artistic soul to secure was rapidly draining away in legal fees and lost opportunities. The immense pressure, the public shame, and the relentless media scrutiny placed an unbearable strain on his marriage to Linda Ibarrondo, his wife since 1965. She had stood by him through the grueling years of his early stage career and the psychological torment of his television fame. While the tabloid exposure severely tested their private lives and completely breached the fortress he had tried to build around his family, Linda remained by his side. Yet, even with his family intact, the profound professional and public isolation drove him further into the abyss. In 2003, Wright was arrested for a second time for driving under the influence in New York. This second arrest lacked the initial shock value of the first. Instead, it carried the heavy, depressing weight of inevitability. It was the undeniable proof of a man in a permanent freefall. The mugshot from this arrest was even more harrowing. It captured a man who looked utterly depleted, stripped of his dignity, and utterly broken by the machinery of fame. He had become a ghost, haunting the fringes of an industry that had chewed him up and violently spat him out. Yet, amidst this chaotic, agonizing period of self-destruction, there was a brief, startling moment of clarity. In 2000, shortly after his first arrest, and before the devastating tabloid scandal, Wright granted a highly uncharacteristic interview to People magazine. For a man who had spent a decade aggressively refusing to speak the name of his sitcom, his decision to talk was a monumental shift. He did not use the interview to defend himself, nor did he attempt to rewrite history. Instead, he offered a raw, unflinching assessment of his defining role. It was a hard work and very grim, Wright confessed to the reporter. In those 7 words, he validated a decade of silent suffering. He did not try to retroactively paint the soundstage as a happy environment. He openly acknowledged the severe psychological toll the production had taken on him. He admitted to the grim reality of his artistic starvation. But then he offered something profound. He offered a concession. After acknowledging his pain, Wright added, "I was hugely eager to have it over with, but it brought a lot of joy to people." This statement was a staggering psychological breakthrough. It was the sound of a man finally laying down his weapons. For years, he had hated the show because it had destroyed his identity. But in that brief interview, amidst the wreckage of his own life, he managed to separate his personal agony from the public's reception. He recognized that the art, even art he fundamentally despised, even art created under humiliating circumstances, had an independent value. He accepted that while the television machine had broken him, the product of his suffering had genuinely entertained millions of people. It was not a joyous reconciliation. It was a bitter, exhausted compromise. He was acknowledging the brutal transaction of his life. He had traded his artistic soul, and in return, the world got a laugh track. It was the closest Max Wright would ever come to making peace with the ghost of Willie Tanner. A fleeting moment of grace before the darkness completely consumed his final years. After the tabloid scandals faded, Max Wright retreated into total obscurity, abandoning the industry that had first elevated and then ruthlessly dismantled him. On June 26, 2019, following a private battle with lymphoma, Wright passed away at the age of 75. Unsurprisingly, his passing was marked by brief nostalgic media headlines, remembering him merely as the exasperated father from a 1980s sitcom. Ultimately, his life stands as a brutal cautionary tale about the true psychological cost of commercial success. Max Wright did not hate his defining role because he was ungrateful for the wealth or the global fame. He hated it because it committed the ultimate artistic theft. It took a brilliant, complex human being, completely erased his identity, and forced a true master of the stage to spend eternity standing in the shadow of a puppet.